Okay, on this note, I'm now going to begin to transition the next section of this presentation. And to bridge that, I want to make a point that not only does the status-generated consumption patterns of most of the public, especially in America, cause a great deal of social stress, leading in part to many of the problems we have just analyzed, the propensity for constant cyclical consumption, which again is required for the entire world economy to function, is also outlining trends which show a clear path to severe environmental problems and the continual breakdown of civilization as we know it, as we destroy all of our natural resources through this idiotic act of conspicuous consumption to fuel GDP. Part 2, prognosis. The prior points made about the well-being and quality of life issues associated with social imbalance is a big issue. However, to be fair, just because there's a propensity for an overweight, violent, diseased, mentally disturbed, selfish, untrusting, illiterate population does not necessarily translate into the consequence of social collapse, as we're beginning to see. So we're going to move on, putting the basic well-being of humanity aside for a moment and focus on the mechanisms of the social system itself and the larger order problems that are being generated. Okay, here's the deal. One of the most critical things to understand, without a shadow of a doubt, proves the unsustainable nature of our current social system and how it is on a collision course with nature, is this. Due to the way money and hence the market system functions, we are locked into an incompatible paradigm where two mutually exclusive operating principles, one, the need for constant consumption or infinite growth, collides with an unyielding finite planet and hence the physical laws of nature. You simply cannot have an infinite growth of commerce and hence consumption in a closed system such as the planet Earth. For all those that don't fully understand this, let me explain more. The planet Earth is basically a closed system when it comes to its resources. All the minerals and energy deposits that we currently use have rates of cultivation that dramatically exceed the lifespan of the human being. For example, oil and fossil fuels in general took over 100 million years easy for them to come about. The same goes for our mineral resources. The 4,400 mineral species out there today took outrageous amounts of time to be created. The diamonds that we find today took over 3 billion years to be created. Now, given this environmental reality, it would seem painfully obvious that the most important aspect of any earthly society would be the preservation of the Earth's resources, right? It would seem, in fact, that the entire basis of any economic structure would have as the number one priority the preservation of the resources of the planet. Why? Because once it's gone, it's gone. For example, even at this stage of scientific inquiry, we cannot take a tire, which contains probably 6 or 7 gallons of oil, and convert it back into combustible fuel. So instead of having a logical system of resource management where we actually monitor the Earth's resources and try, as the human species, to strategically orient our use of these precious finite elements, we came up with something much more interesting. And it's called the infinite growth economic paradigm. In our current system, we grab as many resources as we can, we throw them into anything that we think someone will buy, and we try to manipulate each other into buying these things from us for profit. In fact, the entire basis of the free market ideology is using and exchanging as many resources as possible, as fast as possible, to generate as much money as possible, which in turn is used to exploit more resources over and over again. We've created a global money and profit-driven structure which consists of a circular exchange protocol, if you will, where money must move from the consumer to the employer to the employee, which is the consumer again, and the only way, again, to sustain this pattern, to keep people employed, the only way to keep people eating, the only way to keep GDP up, the only way to keep the stock market up, is through the mandate that goods and services comprised, again, of our finite resources and energy are constantly and perpetually used and sold ad infinitum irregardless of purpose, utility, or respect for what we actually have. I couldn't possibly come up with a more destructive manner for organizing society. And the sad thing is, people don't see this whatsoever. They have been conditioned into ideologies. Capitalism, communism, socialism, well, guess what? Any social ideology, specifically economic, which does not directly relate to the resources of the planet in its doctrines explicitly, meaning the attributes of our environment which actually sustain our lives, is an inapplicable and thus irrelevant social ideology. Case in point, oil and fossil fuels. We live in a hydrocarbon economy, as I'm sure you all know. Our entire economic structure, meaning production, distribution, food cultivation, transportation, etc., is entirely based on energy from fossil fuels. There are 10 calories of hydrocarbon energy in every 1 calorie of food currently consumed in the industrialized world. This is M. King Hubbert, a geologist and, interestingly enough, a technocrat. M. King Hubbert predicted in the late 1940s that the United States would peak in its oil production in 1970. Of course, he was ridiculed, laughed at, and scorned by the scientific establishment. And unfortunately, he was right. The U.S. did peak in the 1970s. In fact, some studies now show that global oil discoveries have likely peaked around the same time. The exact date is debatable, but it doesn't change anything. Now, before I go any further, I know some of you out there are saying, how do we know that these statistics are accurate? How do we know that the research institutions are unaware of existing oil supplies that go undiscovered? And how do we know if the oil corporations themselves, which contain the data, are not lying to simply boost their profits? Well, these are good questions, but there is no question about the decline in the United States. We do import over 70% of our oil now. And as far as the global peak, all you really have to do is look at the drilling patterns of the major corporations to see that almost every major oil company is desperate to find new oil reserves, and they have gone almost everywhere legally possible to do so. The oil on this planet, which took 100 million years to generate, regardless of what you believe about depletion rates, is going to run out one way or another. It is an unsustainable practice. And I won't even go into the obvious dangers associated with burning fossil fuels in regards to its environmental effects, which we're all hearing about today. As an aside, it is not at all irrational or hasty to consider that the peak oil issue just might have something to do with the fact that the United States, which consumes 25% of the world's energy while having only 5% of the population, has the largest permanent military bases in history situated in the Middle East with no evidence whatsoever of ever leaving this region. Obama has already stated that he is going to leave 50,000 troops in the Middle East indefinitely. This is the guy that got the Nobel Peace Prize. As we continue in the Middle East to probe and agitate countries which contain, guess what, the majority of the remaining recoverable oil on this planet, such as Iran. Give it some thought. Now, if you take for a moment to consider that peak oil and its relationship to the economic system and geopolitics might be relevant to the U.S. involvement in the Middle East, you'll tend to find the world starts to make a lot more sense. In the words of M. King Hubbert, we are in a crisis in the evolution of human society. It's unique to both human and geological history. It has never happened before, and it can't possibly happen again. You can only use oil once. Soon, all the oil is going to be burned and all the metals mined and scattered. This is obviously a scenario of catastrophe, but we have the technology. All we have to do is completely overhaul our culture and find an alternative to money. We are not starting from zero. We have an enormous amount of existing technical knowledge, just a matter of putting it all together. A non-catastrophic solution is impossible unless the society is made stable. This means abandoning two axioms of our culture, the current work ethic and the idea that growth is a normal state of life. He continues in a paper he wrote in 1981 called Two Intellectual Systems, Matter, Energy, and the Monetary Culture. Hubbard writes, the world's present industrial civilization is handicapped by the coexistence of two universal, overlapping, and incompatible intellectual systems. The accumulated knowledge of the last 4 centuries of the properties and interrelationships of matter and energy, and the associated monetary culture which has evolved from folkways of prehistoric origin. You simply cannot have a society operate based on this necessity for constant growth to maintain, ironically, stability.